Good day, everyone. Our topic is sample and sampling techniques. I'm Professor Patricia Meru Esomonu, Nandaskiwa University. We are going to look at sample and probability sampling techniques. Our learning outcomes are, after watching this video, you should be able to define sample in a research, explain the meaning of sampling techniques, define probability sampling techniques, identify, explain, and illustrate with examples different probability sampling techniques. Discuss multi-stage sampling techniques. Sample. What is a sample? A sample is a part of population selected for study. It is the subset or fraction of a population selected to participate in the study. It must be a true representative of the population. What does that mean? A true representative sample is one which accurately reflects the characteristics, diversity, or proportions of the population. A research sample is made up of the members of the study population from where the sample, the researcher collects the sample. Sampling techniques. These are methods of selecting sample so that the sample represents the population as accurately as possible. We classify sampling techniques into two. We call some probability sampling techniques and some are non-probability sampling techniques. When we say probability sampling techniques, what does it mean? They are techniques or methods where every member of the study population has a known probability or chance of being included in the research sample. The chance of including each member of the population in the sample can be calculated and are equal. Some sampling techniques include simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, systematic random sampling, cluster random sampling. Simple random sampling. What does that mean? Simple random sampling is a technique of sampling where every member of the population has an equal known chance of being selected. When do we use it? Use when the population is homogeneous or when groups of the population has characteristics that will not affect the variable of interest. Procedure. We do that by balloting, and sometimes we can use random numbers, table of random numbers to select our sample. Stratified random sampling. It involves dividing the population into subgroups called strata and then sampling from each stratum, that is subgroup. This is to ensure that all characteristics in the population are reflected in the sample. When do we use this? We use it when population has groups with varied characteristics or where condition is unevenly distributed in the population with respect of the variable of interest. If we use the topic undergraduate students' perception of online teaching in Anambra State, if the researcher thinks that level of students is a factor, they can simply stratify according to levels. You can also stratify according to gender. We have male and female. Here you stratify according to levels. Then the levels will be year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, as the case may be. Type of stratified random sampling. That's 2, proportionate stratified random sampling and disproportionate stratified random sampling. So proportionate stratified random sampling. This occurs when the same sampling frame or proportion within strata is used to constitute the sample for the study. The subgroups sample size are equal to the proportion of that subgroup in the population. When do we use this? We use it to ensure that sample represents all groups in the population in the proportion they exist in the population, thus providing good estimate for the entire population. So proportionate stratified random sampling is, in constituting your sample, the number of each group will be proportionate to the number, the way they existed in the entire population. Then it is proportionate stratified random sampling. Well, when we say disproportionate stratified random sampling, it will simply be the opposite, kind of. The sample size of each stratum is not dependent on the proportion of the subgroup in the population. This refers to the use of different sampling fractions or proportion in the strata to constitute the sample of the study. It is also used when a researcher wants to study the underrepresented groups in the population or examine the rare extremes of a population. It will ensure that a researcher has an adequate number to study even the smallest group in the population. There are three methods of constituting the sample. Divide the total sample equally among the substrata of the groups. Use different proportions that make sense for the study for different strata. Or adjust the size of the strata by the variability within the stratum. This will make the researcher to collect sample that even the group that are few within the population can be represented and also can be studied. That's the main advantage of disproportionate. Because if you do simple proportionate, it means that a very small group in that population may be represented by the proportion that is will also be very small, that their effect will not be seen. But when somebody is interested in getting the characteristics of every group within the population, you use disproportionate. So for those groups that are small, you select as much as will make sense for you to talk about them or to give results in the variable of interest. Then we have the systematic sampling techniques. It is the sampling techniques where members of the sample are selected from the population at a regular interval. When do we use this? It is used for population that has natural order or sequence. A researcher can also serialize a population to use systematic sampling technique. So how do we do this? Systematic sampling techniques, you first of all have to order your population if it doesn't have natural order. Then you now decide on the sample size. Compare the sample size with that of the population. If the sample size is about 1/3 of the population, that means you have an interval of 3. So you now have, because it is ordered 1 to 3, to select the first proportion, you have to do simple random sampling. Assuming when after the simple random sampling, number 2 is selected, it means the next selection will be 3, 4, 5. We select 5. The next selection will be 6, 7, 8. So you now begin to select in that sequence. That is a systematic simple random sampling used when you have ordered population, or where you order the population in order to use systematic sampling techniques. So the procedure we have mentioned is, first of all, order the population, get your sample size, find the proportion of the sample size to the population. Then for the first interval, use simple random sampling to select it, and then continue to take from the population. Then we have cluster random sampling of individuals called cluster who are naturally together or randomly sampled. When any cluster is selected, all the individuals in that cluster are studied. It is used when a population is large and spread over a wide geographical area. So groups or clustered who meet the study criteria will be sampled. And when any cluster is sampled, every member of that cluster has to be selected. So cluster or area random sampling. So what are we really talking about here? What we are saying is that when we use this kind of sampling is when the population is spread over a large geographical area. Some are in the valley, some are in the hills, some are in the different options. You now cluster them. People in the valley, people in the urban, or people in the mountain, and so on. When you cluster them, you now sample among the clusters. For instance, you now cluster them and you have about 5 clusters. What you do is you sample among the 5 clusters. So any cluster that is picked in that sampling, every member of that cluster has to be selected. Then we now talk about what we call a multi-stage sampling procedure. Multi-stage sampling procedure is not a sampling technique, but a way a researcher chooses to obtain the sample, especially when it involves different stages or levels. Different sampling methods can be used at different levels as appropriate. For instance, if we use the research title, Undergraduate Students' Perception of Online Learning Mode in a university in Anambra State. So multi-stage sampling technique will be appropriate for this. The first stage of sampling will be faculty in the universities. The researcher will now select with a simple random sampling, select about 50% of the faculty. The next level will be departments. Within the department, you can still use simple random sampling to select the number of departments you want to accommodate in your study. Then the third level will be students. If you now come to students, you cannot just use simple random sampling. Why? Because there are male and there are female. So this group, male and female, will now require stratification. You now stratify using gender and then select from the group. So what we have talked about in this lecture. In this video, we talked about sample and then probability sampling techniques. The first video is on sampling. Then we have sampling techniques. And sampling techniques, there are 2 types. Probability sampling techniques and non-probability sampling techniques. For probability sampling techniques, we can calculate the chances of choosing any member of that group. And there are a number of them. We have simple random sampling, we have stratified random sampling, we have systematic random sampling, and we have cluster random sampling. Thank you for watching.